There's a song that links Elvis Presley, U2, Rod Stewart, weddings and political rallies. And it was written in the attic room behind this door. The song is Amazing Grace, and it was written in this room in 1772 by a man named John Newton. He had an epic life full of conflict and drama, a long way from this quiet, genteel vicarage in Buckinghamshire. But Newton was a man who never forgot his traumatic past. He never wanted to. He talked about it every day and put it into his most famous hymn. Amazing Grace is autobiography set to music. I'm on a journey around Britain and across the Atlantic to trace the story of this inspirational and controversial writer.
He was a blasphemous, foul, licentious sailor.
He was somebody who put bums on seats. People came from all over to hear John Newton.
But I also want to uncover the story of his famous hymn, now one of the most popular songs in the world.
I was standing here, and I opened my mouth with my friends behind me and sang, Amazing Grace.
There are some pieces of music like this that we can't imagine sung to any other tune.
When the song was released in the UK, they found that most kids thought it was actually about a girl called Grace. And in America, it's something that unifies the generations.
As soon as the piper strikes up playing Amazing Grace, that's it. I mean, it's people break down at that point.
Is there any other piece like it?
That's the tune.
What's so special about Amazing Grace that turned it from being an English hymn to an anthem of hope for millions? For 15 years, John Newton was priest here in Olney, and every week he would write a hymn. Because he wanted them to be understood by all his parishioners, he used the events of the day for inspiration. He once saw a lion being led through these streets and was fascinated by it. He went home and wrote the hymn, A lion, though by nature wild, the art of man can tame. Not a classic. In 1773, New Year's Day fell on a Friday. But the start of the year was so important to Newton that he decided that there should be the usual Sunday services. He wanted his congregation to assess their spiritual life and prepare for the challenges ahead. He preached a powerful sermon on past mercies and future hopes, encouraging the people to think of all God has done for them. John Newton wrote Amazing Grace to complement that sermon, his thoughts full of what God had done for him throughout his eventful life. It was brand new to his congregation, but for us it's full of familiar, powerful phrases. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Through many dangers, toils and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. It moves me whenever I play it. It was on that New Year's Day that Amazing Grace was sung for the first time. Newton probably would have taught it line by line to his congregation, but not with an organ. It would have been unaccompanied. I invited Pembroke College Choir from up the road in Cambridge to sing Amazing Grace as it might have sounded back in 1773. I'm in for a surprise.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Now that's not what you expected. You see, John Newton didn't write the melody that we know so well. He used existing tunes the congregation would have recognised. Dr. Sam Barrett is Director of Music at Pembroke College.
We can't really know what was sung at that first performance, but we've chosen one that was popular at the time, that was known to both Anglicans and to nonconformists. It appeared in many books around the mid-18th century, so in all probability they'd have known that tune, and it's certainly one that fits.
Wouldn't have sounded like your choir, would it?
No, I suspect it would have been more raucous. There would have been women and children joining in, so it would have been rough around the edges.
And no instruments, of course.
No instruments, indeed. We know that Newton disapproved of these sort of large musical entertainments like Handel's Messiah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said he would prefer Christians to concentrate on the text. So for him it seems that music might have been distracting somehow and taking away from the quality of the text and from the quality of the singing together.
There's so much that's intriguing about Amazing Grace. Where did the tune we know come from? And what of Newton's own life story hinted at in every verse? I'm going to start by exploring his teenage years, when everything started to go seriously wrong. "30 years before Amazing Grace was written, Captain Philip Carteret of HMS Harwich wrote in his ship's log, 'Sent Lieutenant Ruffin with 31 men on board to impress seamen.' In other words, Carteret had a new ship and he needed a crew. A press gang was on its way up the River Medway to Chatham to forcibly enlist anyone they could find. It was February 1744. John Newton was 19 and in love. He was in Chatham visiting Mary Catlett, his childhood sweetheart. Now, he'd been to sea, so he must have known that it was risky to be out alone, because the press gangs would roam the wharfs and inns, getting men drunk, abducting them, or simply knocking them unconscious in some back alley. Captain Carteret's press gang snatched Newton. We don't know exactly how. Later he blamed his thoughtless conduct. Perhaps his clothes marked him out as a sailor. Either way, he found himself on HMS Harwich with 7 other press-ganged men and a hard life in the Royal Navy in front of him. In the heart of the dockyard, Newton would have known, I met Richard Reddy, who's written about the young sailor. Newton had a father, often absent at sea, and a stepmother he didn't get on with, so I wanted to know how that had affected their son.
He was something of a rebel, to be honest.
He was a bit angry, was he?
Yes, he was, and also he was very impetuous, prone to doing rash things. I think his motto was never deliberate. So he was quite a character, not the Newton we know or recognise later on in life.
I suppose there was no sign at that time from this rebellious, mischief-making young man of any musicality, was there?
Well, it's funny you should say that because, apparently he had a knack of writing songs which ridiculed the captain and also lampooned life at sea.
Newton was so unhappy on the Harwich and so unpopular with the captain that when an opportunity arose to switch to a slave ship, they were both glad when Newton jumped at the chance. John Newton began working in the slave trade with a man named Amos Clow, whom he met on board. In the account he wrote of his early life, Newton tells how they successfully traded along the Guinea coast of Africa. But things swiftly began to go wrong. What happened next shaped Newton's whole life and inspired much of Amazing Grace. Clow's mistress, a local chief's daughter named Princess Pi, took an instant dislike to him. I've come to the National Maritime Museum to meet Jonathan Aitken, who's just finished writing a biography of Newton.
Princess Pi hated him from the first moment she saw him. Perhaps she thought in some serious way he was a sort of competition for her, Mr. Clow's friendship and trust, and she had him treated like a slave. He was put in irons, he was starved, and he probably would have died if it hadn't been for the kindness of other slaves. So the first people to show grace to John Newton were actually Africans who were themselves in slavery, and they took pity on a white man being treated as badly as they were.
When he was like a slave himself, is this when he truly feels a wretch?
He always said it was the worst moment of his life, and he never forgot it. He kept an inscription, a biblical inscription, on his vicarage wall, which reminded him that he'd once been a bondsman, which was another way of saying he was in slavery.
Newton sent letters to his father in England, begging to be rescued. But it would be almost 2 years before a ship called the Greyhound was able to track him down. I find it fascinating that John Newton describes himself as a wretch in Amazing Grace, not because of his cruel work as a slave trader, but because of his humiliating experience in Africa as a slave. But his adventure was far from over. Newton had to face more dangers, toils and snares. On his way home to England in March 1748, the ship was struck by a terrible storm. The sea tore away most of the upper timbers and the vessel began to fill up with water. Newton took his turn, first at the pumps and then at the helm, as the crew fought for their lives. I'll read you Newton's own words as to what happened next. Almost spent with cold and labour, I went to speak to the captain who was busied elsewhere, and just as I was returning from him, I said, almost without meaning, "If this will not do, the Lord have mercy on us." Ever after, Newton marked the anniversary of that day as a turning point in his life. About this time, he said, "I began to know that there is a God who hears and answers prayer." It was the moment he began to truly believe. Newton's experiences had such an effect on him that even 25 years after he'd left Africa, he wanted to put them in what would become his most famous hymn. But he still had much to learn about his faith and the true meaning of grace. The storm didn't put Newton off a life at sea, nor did his newfound faith stop him trading in slaves. Over the next 5 years, he made Liverpool his home port as he made profitable voyages to Africa and America, first as mate and then as captain. Newton kept a journal during his 5 years in slave ships. It's one of the key sources we have about the slave trade in the 18th century. Not once did he admit to having any unease about his work. In fact, Newton begins the journal with the Latin phrase, "It will be pleasant to remember these things in after times." The journal is a detailed account of his voyages, the weather, church services, the number of slaves captured, and the punishments he handed out. It seems astonishing to me that this God-fearing man could be reading the Bible in his cabin, on conducting church services for the crew, while down below him human beings were chained in agony. But at that time, slavery was a respectable profession. Cities were built on the profits of the slave trade. Here in Liverpool, merchants were honoured by having streets named after them. Newton believed that his Christian faith only required him to be more considerate to his slaves. "I will treat them with humanity while under my power, and not render their confinement unnecessarily grievous," he said. In later years, he would realise that just wasn't good enough. In November 1754, on the eve of his 4th voyage as captain, Newton had a violent fit. His doctors advised him not to sail, so he resigned his command and never went to sea again. Newton settled in Liverpool with his new wife Mary and started work for the customs house, boarding ships and checking their cargo. I'm intrigued by the imagery of the lines in Amazing Grace. "'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." But a trip on the Mersey could provide an answer. Stuart Wood knows this stretch of water well, having worked for almost 40 years as a river pilot, taking ships up the Mersey and into port.
Newton coming here would be familiar with the pilots and would be familiar with the the opportunity that the pilot brought to the ship of calming everything down. They might have had a terrible passage, terrible weather, and they were just very keen to get in.
There must be a few wrecks in this river, I would think, are there?
Well, I think probably thousands. Not recently, but in 200 and 300 years ago, there were lots of them.
So around Newton's time, that last bit of coming in was really as dangerous as being out there in the middle of the ocean.
In many ways, more dangerous. And the pilot, even in those days, certainly today, it's his job to make sure that the welcome is wholehearted. It's the end of the voyage, Rick, and the beginning of another voyage, so we're at the sharp end.
Newton's lines about grace having brought me safe thus far and grace will lead me home become much clearer out here on the water. He's using imagery from his time as a sailor, grateful to be led safe to port by the experienced pilot. I'd sort of class it as a tribute to people like yourself and pilots going back through the years, that Newton actually wrote the lines in Amazing Grace. How do you feel about that?
It's a great tribute, there's no two ways about that, you're absolutely right. The sad thing possibly is that it's not widely known as a tribute from Newton all those years ago to the local people who provided a safe and welcoming homecoming to the likes of him. It gives a nice warm feeling, even though it's a couple of hundred years ago.
A short walk from the dockside, John Newton and Mary bought a house here in Edmund Street. His work for customs was not a busy one, and he had plenty of time to devote himself to Bible study and listening to evangelical preachers such as George Whitefield, who once preached to 4,000 people in Liverpool at 5 o'clock in the morning. After 9 years in Liverpool, this former blasphemer and infidel, as John Newton described himself, was a very different man. I've been told that there's something in this church in Childwall, on the outskirts of the city, that shows just how much he'd changed. Albert,
well,
very pleased to meet you. Church warden Albert Ramsay showed me around. I can't wait to see what this is.
Right, it's something we're very proud to have. It is very well protected.
I'm intrigued by this one.
This is what I think you want to see.
Childwell Parish Church, Church Warden's Accounts and Parish Minute Book, 1677 to 1772.
Right. Now then. There.
Oh, Mr. Newton, 1764, May the 20th, spent when Mr. Newton preached. What is it? Will that be 2 shillings? 2 shillings. 2 bob. He's come an awful long way from a sort of a slave trade, hasn't he, really?
He has indeed. It's about 6 miles from his home in the city, but from what you're saying, he's travelled a great distance in his faith.
Newton became a preacher because church leaders across the north of England heard about his experiences and then invited him to tell their congregations the story at first hand. He began to feel that being in the pulpit was where God wanted him to be. When Newton spoke here in 1764, aged 38, he'd just been ordained into the Church of England ministry. Marilyn Rouse, a leading expert on Newton, believes that at first he wasn't a natural-born preacher.
One of the independent churches in Leeds, he was invited to preach.
This was his first time, yeah?
Yeah, and you can imagine the scene on Sunday afternoon tea, and the minister came up to him and said very discreetly, you know, we've got a room if you'd like to go and prepare, Mr. Newton. Oh, no, he says, I'm quite fully prepared. And he climbed up in the pulpit and announced his text and dried up totally.
So what happened?
He just crawled out of the pulpit and the minister got up and he preached on how you should allow the Holy Spirit to control everything.
It was about this time that Newton started to write hymns, but it wouldn't be the people of Liverpool who'd be the first to sing them. A few weeks after being paid his 2 shillings in Childwall, John Newton headed south to Olney in Buckinghamshire, his first parish as a Church of England minister. He wrote, I hope that at Olney we shall not find such barren, tedious Sabbaths as have been our usual appointment at Liverpool. He was a man on a mission. Olney was going to get shaken up whether it liked it or not. A wealthy patron paid him £200 a year to keep an open house for the poor and needy. Another enlarged the vicarage especially for him. A humble and grateful Newton wrote in his diary, foreshadowing the words of Amazing Grace, "I am a poor wretch that once wandered naked and barefoot without a home." It was in Olney that Newton became a prolific hymn writer, producing one a week. But he didn't spend his whole time in the attic room conjuring up rhymes. I met up with historian Brian Edwards.
He was often found riding out over the fields in his old sea captain's jacket, which horrified some of his fellow clergymen because that wasn't really the thing to do. But he was a little bit of a maverick in that sense. In writing hymns and singing hymns in church was a bit of a maverick approach even in his day.
It was here, at the end of 1772, that John Newton wrote the 24 lines that would become his most famous hymn. The words grace or gracious appear in nearly 3/4 of Newton's hymns. I wanted to know from Brian why grace was so important to John Newton and what did he understand it to be.
Grace meant for him the love of God for such an undeserving sinner, bearing in mind his background, what he was, a blasphemous, foul, licentious sailor. And grace for him was God's mercy in calling him, choosing him, selecting him, and showing him who least deserved it, his love and his compassion in Christ, so that he who had such a terrible background actually knew that all his sins were forgiven, not because of anything Newton had done, but because what God had done for him, and that was grace.
In Britain, Amazing Grace will be pretty much ignored for the next 200 years as just one of many hymns that John Newton wrote. So just what happened to Amazing Grace that transformed it from a New Year hymn to a universal anthem and pop hit? To find the answer, I have to head west, a little further than the end of Olney High Street.
By 1787, Amazing Grace had crossed the Atlantic and was published first here in New York. We don't know who brought the hymn over, but we do know that there was something about it that appealed to this young nation.
Late 18th century America was fertile ground for new hymns. Many states were being overrun by religious revivals. Churches were so full that meetings had to be held in the open air to accommodate the crowds. I met up with theologian Bruce Hindmarsh to find out why, amongst hundreds of hymns, Amazing Grace became such a favourite with these enthusiastic congregations.
I had the chance to sit down and flip through hundreds of hymnals just to see where Amazing Grace was set, like a jewel set against different backgrounds. And you could see in some congregations in New York, they used it to teach people what to believe about everlasting life. And then the last three stanzas talk about the remainder of this life, about death, and about when this earth will dissolve like snow and the sun no longer shine, when all things will end. And then in other congregations, they used it in church worship for a kind of liturgical church service. But then in other congregations, they're singing it as a song of feeling, and it's a story of conversion.
Of course, by this time, Amazing Grace hadn't acquired its now very famous tune.
Isn't that fascinating? There's some pieces of music like this, some hymns, that we can't imagine them sung to any other tune. Over the course of the 19th century, it was sung to at least 24 different tunes. And it was not sung to the tune we sing it to today. But the tune itself may have been of Scottish origin. And there is some speculation that the old Scottish ballad Fair Helen of Kirkconnell might have actually spawned a number of tunes that the Scots-Irish settlers brought with them, and that emerged as what we call these American folk melodies that eventually got written down.
In the early 19th century, a musical style called shape note singing spread the popularity of these melodies. This tradition still survives, and I've invited some local shape note singers to help us trace the history of the Amazing Grace tune.
Shape music emerged as a way to teach people how to sing better. And what they would do is they would take those tones, fa, sol, la, mi, fa, and they would tie them to different shapes. And so fa would be a triangle and a rectangle for la, and so on, so that you could immediately recognize where you were in the scale without the need to know what key you're in. No instruments, just voices. It was all about participation, just singing through, and singing through with energy and gusto.
1 and 3.
In what they call their hollow square, the singers are going to perform St Mary's, a tune that may be a close descendant of the Scottish ballad.
I can hear where the Scottish influence came from.
You can just imagine the Scots-Irish immigrants in the West singing that, can't you?
So how on earth then did Amazing Grace end up with the tune that we now know?
Well, that tune is circulating. It's in several of the early shape note tune books in the 1820s, but it was the genius of a man named William Walker in 1835 to put together the tune with the words in a tune book called Southern Harmony, which sold something like 600,000 copies before the Civil War. Very popular tune book. He named the tune New Britain, and he put Amazing Grace to it. And that's where Amazing Grace finally met its tune.
A true marriage made in heaven then.
That's right.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see.
It's a spine-tingling sound, and it's a shame that John Newton never heard it, because it took 60 years for his words to find this marvellous tune. But Amazing Grace needed one more polish to create the version we now know. The man to do that was the magnificently named Edwin Othello Excel. He printed hymn books in their millions, and he knew exactly what his congregations wanted. For middle-class American churchgoers at the turn of the 20th century, the shape note hymns were just too basic, not harmonious enough. The shape note choirs, for example, in Amazing Grace, the version of New Britain, had a lot of fifths in it. And the best way I can describe fifths is that they sound quite open. I'll play a few. So what Excel did at the turn of the century was to add what we call the third, which is the harmony, which sweetens everything out. which is much warmer and much more acceptable to middle-class America. And there's one other thing that's different about Excel's version. At some time in the 19th century, Newton's last two stanzas were replaced by, "When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun." It comes from a completely different hymn, "Jerusalem, my happy home." In the 19th century, it was common to steal verses in this way, but I'm not sure Newton would have approved of this verse. When we've been there, where? The hymn now doesn't make sense. Bright shining as the sun. That's far too showy for John Newton. But it is a rousing, optimistic ending for the hymn, which I think further explains its success. The arrival of recorded music in the 20th century took Amazing Grace out of the churches and into the streets and clubs. Newton's words began to lose their religious meaning. They came to be seen as more of a secular song than a hymn. In the 1960s, it was a cry for freedom sung at civil rights marches, and in folk clubs it was sung as a traditional American ballad. And there was one folk singer whose version of Amazing Grace was to change the story of the hymn forever. Over 30 years ago, Judy Collins made her famous recording here at St. Paul's Chapel on the campus of Columbia University.
My life was terrible when I recorded Amazing Grace. I was in such a bad state. I had all this success. I had successful albums and all my career was certainly going along like clockwork, but I really was an example of the 60s gone crazy. And I went to an encounter group, which was drug rehabilitation process by which you sort of tear each other to pieces and then you feel better, supposedly. So one night we had learned it so well that everybody was sort of in pieces on the floor, and my producer, Mark Abramson, who was in the group as well, said to me, "Why don't you sing something? Everybody feels so horrible and they're all kind of demolished by this encounter group." And so I sang Amazing Grace, and everybody just melted, started hugging each other, separated as friends again. And the next morning he called me and he said, "We have to put this song on this album," which was almost done.
I've been really lucky in my life to be involved with various people who have recorded tracks that at the time you think, wow, this is something really, really special. Did you feel that way when you were recording Amazing Grace?
I thought this was something special when I walked in this church because I knew what we were going to do. I knew we were going to do Amazing Grace, and it was going to sound the way I wanted it to sound.
Just for me, would you recreate that moment?
Yes, well, I was standing here, and I opened my mouth with my friends behind me and sang, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see."
I just really feel I should applaud here. Hasn't changed one iota your voice.
Judy's version of Amazing Grace was a big hit on both sides of the Atlantic. It was the surprise success of 1971. Few people realised that it was a hymn, let alone written by an English country curate.
Are you aware that after Newton wrote Amazing Grace in 1772, that it was almost lost, it wasn't really sung in Britain until you made it a huge hit in England, and basically 200 years later gave it back to us?
Well, it was the least I could do. Well, I think these things have reason. I think things happen for a reason. And I do think that the creative aspect was important, of course. But I think the spiritual aspect for what it gave to people in England and here and wherever the song is used is enormous. I would close concerts with this song and people would just go crazy because they need it. And there's a sense of community about people who know that they've been touched by grace, who know that there are things in their lives that could not have happened but for something much bigger than they were. Certainly it was grace that brought that song to my life, without any doubt.
Judy's Amazing Grace not only made us Brits realise what a great song it was, it led to many other artists deciding that they too wanted to sing Newton's words. Author Steve Turner has traced the history of the hymn.
I think that there must be people who must have been kicking themselves that they knew this song, they'd grown up with it in church, but they'd never recorded it. I mean, for example, Elvis Presley. I mean, he loved gospel music, he loved hymns, but he'd never recorded it, but he did after Judy Collins. Aretha Franklin recorded it after Judy Collins. Coming from the gospel tradition, she might have had more commitment to it, and may have also seen it as a song that was about Black America's struggles, or my personal struggles. You know, I've just gone through a divorce, and so she sort of charged it with a load of emotion.
Why do you think it works as a piece of church music and also as a standard secular piece of music in a strange way?
I think in a funny way, it's a very specifically Christian song. You couldn't have a song sort of more suffused with theology, yet it only mentions God's name once. So a non-Christian person could just be thinking of the song as something about like having a second chance. Some churches thought, this song's become a pop hit, you know, this is a kind of a bridge across which the church can connect with the younger generation. But when they did a survey, they found that most kids thought it was actually about a girl called Grace.
So what do you think Newton would make of all of that?
I think he'd be pleased that his words, virtually untouched, I mean, you got that addition of the 10,000 years verse, but virtually untouched, really, over 200 years later, is still out there and it has this broad appeal. It's something that unifies the generations.
In the aftermath of the terrible attacks of September the 11th, Amazing Grace took on a new role. At the many memorial services and funerals, this 230-year-old hymn was called upon to bring comfort in a modern tragedy. It became almost a spiritual national anthem. I met up with two New York Police Department bagpipers who've played Amazing Grace many, many times since 9/11.
About 2 weeks after the event, we had a joint memorial service with the fire department band, basically just to show support for the rescue and recovery workers. It was actually at the site.
And you still had the huge pile of...
it was still smoldering.
It was still on fire. So, you know, they had a little memorial in the morning there. That was tough, and then a year later, on the anniversary, we ended up playing in the, when all the debris was cleared, we ended up playing right in the base, played Amazing Grace down there.
How many times have you played Amazing Grace?
Countless times.
Thousands, maybe?
We lost 23 guys on our job, and it was hard enough getting those funerals done. And the fire department lost 343 guys. So they physically couldn't cover all the funerals, so we would assist them doing their funerals as well. You know, doesn't matter if they're Catholic, you know, Jewish, Protestant, white, black, green, orange. We play Amazing Grace for them.
What effects have you seen it have on people when you've performed it?
it's a simple song, playing-wise. I know Joe and myself, when we first started playing, that's one of the first tunes that your instructor ever teaches you. And, you know, it's the one song, of all of the thousands and thousands of bagpipe tunes, it's the one song that has more power than anything else you could possibly play on a bagpipe. As soon as those first couple notes come and people know that it's Amazing Grace, it sets the tone of the ceremony. It sets the mood, the feel, and it really evokes emotions that I guess some people didn't realize they'd be able to get at. You see a family standing there, and they know it's coming. They know that their loved one's going to be carried out of the back of the hearse and brought into the church. And as soon as the piper strikes up playing Amazing Grace, that's it. I mean, it's people break down at that point. I guess when you're playing Amazing Grace, it helps send the guy home.
As a piper and as a cop, what's Amazing Grace mean to you?
It doesn't. I wouldn't want to say it means a good thing. I mean, when we're playing it, we know one of ours went down. But on the flip side of that, when you're playing it, you know, maybe you're helping the family get through that time. So maybe it's got it's like a double-edged sword in a way.
Is there any other piece like it?
No.
That's it.
That's the tune. And will be forever, I would say.
Amazing Grace seems to fit bagpipes perfectly. Perhaps the theory that the tune comes from an old Scottish ballad has some truth. John Newton's hymn has touched America like no other. It seems to appeal to their sentimental side. They may be a nation of different races, but the story in the song unites them. It's their story of coming through dangers, toils and snares, and being led to safety, being led home. I've brought the story of Amazing Grace safely home, but what of its author, John Newton? After 16 years as curate in Olney, he came as rector to St Mary's Woolnoth in the heart of the city of London. He soon proved to be extremely popular. Regulars complained that their pews were always filled with visitors who'd come to hear Newton preach. On Sunday, December the 4th, 1785, a young man waited until after the service to drop off a note for the rector. He'd first met Newton in Olney as a small boy, brought by his aunt to hear Newton's sermons. William Wilberforce was the 26-year-old, rich, rising star of British politics, but he was worried about being seen with Newton, who was mocked in some circles as an enthusiast or even a Methodist.
The letter really said, in language which might have been James Bond writing to his sort of controller, it was so full of secrecy, keep this secret, keep this confidential, no one must know I'm coming. Could I come and see you privately? And they had obviously some quite deep conversation here in the vestry, and then a much, much deeper conversation which in a way changed history at Newton's home, because Wilberforce in effect said, I want to be a clergyman, and Newton rather unexpectedly said, don't you do that, stay where you are in politics, my boy, and serve God through Parliament. And if he'd given the advice the other way, I don't think slavery would have been abolished quickly, and Wilberforce certainly wouldn't have been part of it.
It seems that after this meeting, Newton's life changed too. Privately, he'd begun to question the morality of the slave trade, which, for a decade, had been his living. But Wilberforce's campaign against the trade seems to have galvanised the older man into joining the abolitionist cause.
Newton was Wilberforce's technical expert on how it had all happened, how it worked. He'd done it all, he'd seen it all. So he was enormously influential to the Privy Councillors, who included the Prime Minister and so on. And they all heard Newton and heard him with great respect, because everybody knew that this was a truthful witness, a man of great stature, great author, a great figure in the church. And yet he had been in this foulest and most vicious of trades.
3 years after their meeting at St Mary's, Newton wrote an explosive pamphlet about the slave trade. It's part moral argument, part confession. I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders. The pamphlet sold in its thousands.
Although toward the end of his life, Newton's hearing began to fail, his enthusiasm for the gospel message did not. When it was his curate's turn to preach, he would sit in the pulpit with him so that he could catch every word. Newton was ready for death, but he was not afraid. "I am packed and sealed and waiting for the post," he joked. In fact, it's clear from the words of Amazing Grace that for many years he was ready to face his Creator. "Yes, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace."
John Newton died on December the 21st, 1807, having lived just long enough to see the slave trade abolished. His epitaph he wrote himself, a brief final sermon, once again using his shameful past to show what the grace and mercy of God had done for him. Amazing Grace was just one of the many hymns that Newton wrote in this room. When he finished it, I don't believe he thought there was anything particularly special about it, except that it dealt with two of his favourite themes: his past as a lost wretch and the grace of God that saved him. Although when singing or listening to the hymn, the true meaning of grace can often be forgotten, for Christians in these days leading up to Easter, grace becomes all important. When we contemplate the events of the Easter story, Amazing Grace becomes not about feeling good, but about feeling unworthy. Unworthy to be saved by a God who unconditionally loves his foolish and grumpy creation. In my travels, I've learned that whether you're a Christian or not, the words of Amazing Grace, together with the wonderful tune it picked up along the way, has the ability to bring comfort and hope. We may not have had John Newton's colourful past, but in a way we've all felt lost at some stage in our lives, encountered dangers, toils and snares, and yearned to be led safely home. Amazing Grace is John Newton's life, compressed into 6 verses. It can also be your story and my story. That's the power of the hymn. It's also a reminder that powerful words and a sweet melody can lead to something profound, something truly amazing.
That saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now